The Day After program will consider 5 global challenges that COVID-19 has brought to the forefront of public debate. Inspired by classic and modern films along with the reflections of leading public intellectuals, we will discuss alternative narratives that might help us as we look ahead to the day after. Today, I will discuss the topic of human flow, immigrants and refugees, with Weiwiwei, the famous Chinese artist and activist, and with Yves Daacore, the former Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross. It seems like we are at a very interesting historical moment which might be a turning point in the relationship between states and their citizens. As the public turns to governments for greater protection, politicians use public fear to deny liberty and basic human rights. Are you concerned that the next stage of this process might be more governments trying to silence artists? Should we look at the COVID-19 crisis as a danger not just for humans but also for the arts?
This crisis certainly shows the potential how the government would control the mass or individuals. The perfect example is in China. During the crisis, the government started to build a much stronger civilian controlling method. The big data to collect the facial identification and your health information and who you talk to, what you buying on the line, and also what kind of activity you have is completely put in this state control. So our human society never had such much efficient and strong control from the power.
Unlike doctors, artists are not defined as essential workers these days. Do you believe that artists do have an essential role in this time?
I think artist functions more as a modern time philosopher, which has to be visionary and very critical and very creative. But the art itself completely collapsed or it's not functioning at all today. You rarely see art community or art institution or individual artists respond to this human crisis spontaneously. So I think that's is corruption of the art world.
Now when museums and theaters are closed and it's also unclear when the audience will start visiting them again, how do you think the art world would or maybe should change in the day after the pandemic?
Honestly, I think I feel sorry many, art institution has facing extremely difficult time, and also personally, I try to support them in many ways. But I think they should understand they deserves to face in this time, because for too long they are not active enough. They are not relevant in the social change. So they should find a new position and a new world point of view and a new action. So this is really, you cannot really just rescue someone have a fundamental problem or illness. They should act really much more passionately or creatively to rescue themselves.
These days, you're working on 3 new documentaries, one of them about the COVID-19 outbreak in Wuhan. But in fact, long before we even imagined this crisis, one of your most famous works was about a previous cover-up of Chinese authorities. You investigated the deaths of thousands of students who died when schools fell apart during the 2008 Sichuan earthquake. You paid a heavy price for your criticism when in 2011 Chinese authorities imprisoned you and you had to flee the country. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're investigating now in your new film, and are you concerned that the things you will reveal will put you in this kind of danger again?
I have a tradition of doing investigation work, The police said, you're artist, why you function as a investigation journalist or a lawyer? I think I do all the jobs. I do. That's why I do the films for also Wuhan. Just tell the truth. The fact will teach people. History will testify. If something is truthful or not. So there's always cover up in China. Still, they should ask is not why they cover up, but rather this kind of cover up, which is not healthy for any state. So I think they should have confidence of how to govern and to let people understand the truth and to work together. So my effort is not trying to point fingers to anybody, but rather to say the truth is helpful for the intelligence and for judgment. And I don't think I'm facing more danger, because the danger is always there. I always say, if you're not telling the truth, the danger is bigger.
But do you know of any new measure that Chinese authorities are already trying to take against you?
I don't know. I always trying to think Chinese government also have some rationality, and they understand what I'm doing is good for the nation and good for the people. And if they don't understand that, I couldn't help. I have no bad or ill intention to attack anybody.
Last week, you revealed one of your new work. You designed face masks as a campaign for free speech whose sales will benefit humanitarian organizations. Is this a response to people that gave up hope these days?
Yeah, I think so. I think very often when we meet a large crisis, we will say, okay, as an individual, what can we do? I think it's really a crisis about ourselves and about me. So if I don't do anything, I think that means I totally give up. That's not a good sign for life. And so I always trying to initiate some kind of communication and trying to help the people who is on the front line in defending human dignity. So that's why we started selling those masks. We raised over $1 million for those organizations. It's not much, but it's sweet. For the people in desperate situation, they realize there's a support.
In 2017, you made a film Human Flow that our viewers will watch later on the refugee crisis. Over the past 3 years, the numbers of statusless people only increased, and it's expected to rise even further because of the climate change. If you were making the movie today, what would you film? What do you think is the next chapter in refugee crisis?
Yeah, in the 2017, the human flow, that time is only 70 million refugees worldwide. Now we can easily say it's over 100 million. And due to many issues, climate change, famine, and geo warfares. And also after coronavirus, I'm saying after, we don't even know when it will be after. You say the Brazil and Mexico, the number is still very high. So we can say after this globalization, and finally we have to pay the debts and the cost of the fast developing and the huge cooperative gaining, and a lot of people been living underpaid or lost their job. So that's what happens in the United States. When we say the grass is very dry, once they catch the fire, it starts burning. It's not just about a racial problem, it's a total problem.
You often say that the raw material of your work is reality itself. I can very much relate to this statement. Recently, I directed a play in which African asylum seekers played Israeli parliament members who wanted to deport them. The text was a real protocol from the parliament meeting, and the goal was to put Israelis in asylum seekers' shoes and vice versa. But I often wonder, is there still a demand for art that is not pleasant? Don't people prefer that art will make them forget rather than think?
Traditionally, or for a long time, people only see art as a part of the beauty. So the beauty is about part of the decorative. So I see art is about consciousness, inspiration, and to build up human emotions, to realize who we are, and how to share our, our inspiration to others, to support the other life. So there's always argument politically and artistically.
Do you believe art can still change people's values in a world where social medias don't let us even expose to people with other opinions?
Art functions more like a virus. It seems doesn't have a function. Viruses doesn't even have a life, but it always have to attach to a normal so-called shells or healthy shells. So every of our human are really rooted in our spirit. Art is helping us to understand who we are, and that helps us to change ourselves. But the human society are really a group of individuals. So once I can change myself, it will change somebody else.
One of your new documentaries will be about a recent protest in Hong Kong. Do you believe that the newly passed national security law is the end of the semi-autonomous city?
The newly passed so-called Chinese national security law, if it's being applied to Hong Kong, that will be like a last nails for the coffin. And that will finish Hong Kong as an independent or free trading market, but become one of the Chinese internal cities. That means China can apply their law ruthlessly in Hong Kong, and of course the liberty Hong Kong had, which attracted foreign investment, and the exchange will be finished.
So, is there a chance that we will see a new immigration wave from Hong Kong?
It will be huge. UK just announced that they would accept from 30 and 300,000 to 2 million, much more migration to go to UK, and I think that's a positive responsibility from UK, because it was UK's territory, and many will move to Canada, and also possibly Australia and the US.
You have been protesting against Chinese policy for many years, while many liberal countries overlooked it. Now it seems like the problems with Chinese policies have become more visible than ever. The world can't ignore the fact that if Chinese government had been more transparent about COVID-19 outbreak, many lives could have been saved. Do you think that the West has woken up too late and is still too soft about Chinese government?
But the problem with China is they never had a political reform. They always believe this is the most efficient way, to have this kind of authoritarian state. And also they never trust their own people. So never let anybody vote. That means that power itself has a problem of being legitimacy. You're not legitimate. So that will be the internal illness to make the heart still bumping in China. So this is a big problem. But at the same time, China, if they don't want to stop to make the economic development, they have to develop their own strategy, such as one road, one belt policy to extend their influence in South or Latin America, Africa, and in many ways. So that already threatens the Western view about the new world order. In many ways, China has become very influential in every way. In U.S. research center, universities, or political structure in UN and the WHO. It simply become a spokesperson for Chinese propaganda. This threatens the core values of the Western system. So that made Europe has to respond, and also made the US to respond. So far, only US clearly responded. And Europe is so badly divided. There's no such thing as Europe. Each nation functions very differently. They have their own ambition, their own interests, and European Union simply doesn't function at all. If you look at when they're dealing with the coronavirus, Europe is Europe only because they believe in a better human future, humanity. That's kind of a product of a civilized society and the freedom of speech, transparency. So if you sacrifice those things just for economic gaining, I think that is very short-sighted, and it will bring back the consequence. Coronavirus is good lesson for the whole world to learn. It's only started from a little cover up from the beginning. They delayed maybe 22 days to 1 month. This is clearly on record. They says it's not human to human transmission or transmittable, and even WHO worked with the same language. So that gave a crucial time for the disease to be spread. 5 million of the people left the Wuhan. And till now, US and England still heavy price. The shutdown of the global economy is unthinkable what kind of price the world is paying, only because their partners are not trustful. And they have such important partner as China.
My last question to you. 3 months ago, you were asked in an interview if your art had been able to make a significant change in Chinese politics. You said that, unfortunately, the answer is not really. Why do you keep trying?
I don't think my art has any significant meaning toward Chinese society. I'm trying only because I'm a very selfish person. I want to survive my ideology, and I believe what I fight, I could help someone somewhere.
So even if you help one person, that's enough for you.
So we all have a candle in our mind, and that we don't want that fire to be disappeared.
It was a great honor to talk to you.
It's very nice talking to you, and it's a great honor. Thank you.
Now, I'm pleased to invite Yves Daacour, the former Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross, who only recently left the organization after leading it for 10 years.
Thank you. Happy to be with you.
Before the COVID-19 crisis, the number of immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers has reached unprecedented proportions. More than 70 million people around the world were forced to flee their countries. Now, there's a good chance that the pandemic will affect the ways we think about immigration. I can imagine two very different scenarios. The first one is negative. The pandemic will only increase xenophobia and racism of the same kind we already see in the US. The second scenario, the pandemic becomes the great equalizer, reminding us that we are all equally vulnerable and that our governments are responsible for protecting the poor and the weak. What scenario sounds more likely to you?
When you think about pandemia, there is always, and we've seen that in history, always three big scenarios. And I'm careful about that. But one scenario is we go through the pandemia and our society don't change a lot. They are a little bit shaken up. They are a bit more fragile. The scenario two is the situation becomes very difficult. There is a lot of unrest. The society found difficult to catch up. There is more inequalities, and you start to see unrest, and then you start to see a more, I would say, military, police, emergency, state of emergency, and sometimes authoritarian response. And the scenario three is it's when a pandemic really hits so hard that you have a collapse of the society. And I think when you think about migration and pandemia, we need to be with the first and the second scenario. We're living in a time where there's a lot of uncertainty. I'm not sure at all what will be the result of the pandemic overall. I'm right now in Boston, for example, and I would have not predicted a few days ago that you have so much tensions. And you say the tensions which are, of course, related to COVID, but also to inequalities and to racism, for example. That leads clearly suddenly to a very unexpected result and tension. So to respond to your questions, I think sadly, we will go more towards your first scenario, which is in fact for a time, for a while at least, it will be difficult for a country to open up, reflect about the migrant questions, though I hope really that we will be able to find solutions. But let's say short term, most of the country, I think, will be willing to be tougher on migration. They want to close the border. They think that's the way, it's the best way to react. They want to show that they are controlling the situation. And they might even want to use, and we saw that with the lockdown, some specific, I would say, emergency measure. The key questions for me is how are we, in fact, integrating our country, integrating the migrants' questions in their response. And we've seen that migrants so far are because they are the one who are sometimes having the most difficult job. They are on the front line. They're already suffering in terms of health. They have no money, or they've lost a lot of money. They lost remittance. So I think the migration questions will be important. But in general, I'm rather, I would say, pessimistic, at least for the first coming period, about the migration question. So much more likely to go to the scenario one.
Would it be correct to say refugees are one of the groups at the highest risk due to the pandemic?
They are always at risk in general as a population. They are far away from their country. They don't have a social ecosystem and a social fabric to help them. Most of them are forced to migrate. And of course, when you think about COVID-19, COVID-19 is hitting them at least at 3 or 4 different fronts. One, of course, in terms of health, they are in places where, for example, having the safe measure, social distancing, the health, the hygiene, all that is not accessible. So, and it will not be accessible over time. We also know that for them, in terms of being able to have remittance, to have the money, the resources from their family, or to give the resource to their family will diminish. So I think for them, the situation will be difficult. And third, in terms of security, you will have more constraint for migrants and for refugees in general, much more. It's rather clear people will not travel easily already for all of us, but imagine for migrant refugees. So I think the situation for refugee and migrant in general will be more difficult over the next coming months. I'm deeply convinced about that, yes.
In April, President Trump announced his intention to suspend immigration to the U.S. Do you think this announcement would affect other leaders, and if so, how?
I think there are numbers of announcements which are of a political nature, which and I've seen that in migration in general. A lot of country, by the way, not just the United States of America, a lot of country around the world. I'm thinking about Australia, for example, Denmark, to take 3 countries completely different. They are using also communication and announcements as a way to manage migrants, as a way to make sure that migrants will not come, or at least to try to contain migrants. And we've seen that before COVID-19 already. And now, of course, COVID-19 is just a way to accelerate that. There is no differences about that. But of course, let's say leaders in the world are influenced by that, and they will watch very carefully about what it works. And leaders in the world, first and foremost, they want right now, as they are not sure about COVID-19 and the impact of COVID-19, what they want to control. They want to control their border. They want to try to make sure that they control also human flux between countries, but also within their own country. So you will see more announcement around that. And I think it will be very difficult for, again, the weakest people, if you want, or the people the most vulnerable, the people who have no document, who have no money, who are very, very weak. Of course, they will be the first one to suffer. Absolutely.
President Trump also announced ending the U.S. relationship with the World Health Organization. Do you think that international humanitarian organizations will regularly be under this kind of attack?
I think the first element for me is at the time where we need to have a strong collaboration. And I think if there's one thing we've learned with COVID-19, if we need it, is that we are one world, connected. And the fate of what happens right now in Israel has an impact on me in the US or in Switzerland or in Africa. So I think there is something which we knew it, but again, a confirmation, the fact that we are connected and that your fate will have an impact on mine and reciprocity. So I would say anything which is an attack against collaboration, anything which tries to diminish and somewhat create impossibility to work together is a huge problem for me, really. And I think it's a call for control, it's a call for containment, it's a call for us versus the other. And in the age of COVID-19, this is not only damaging, but it's extremely risky over time because it will not help us to move as a society. That's for sure. And we as an international organization in general, yes, we will have to not so much find different ways to support, but continue to fight to make sure that we are creating consensus on critical issues, consensus between society, between country, on critical issues. If we are not able to have a consensus on issue as important as public health, for example, then I'm very worried for our world.
Have you noticed a phenomenon of asylum seekers who are afraid of being tested or getting treatment, even if they have the access, simply due to their fear of immigration authorities or losing their jobs?
Yeah. Yes, it's not, by the way, just migrants. We see that in a lot of situations where you do have people I would call off the grid, somewhat not willing or not in a position to access, for example, the service of the government. But it's true, undocumented migrants, for example, are the ones who are very careful because they are very nervous to be immediately detected, and then that this access to health will also mean suddenly the end for them to stay in the country and being expelled. So I think, yes, I've seen a lot of cases. And that's a big worry because it means when you do a public health work in a big country or in a region, and we've seen that with COVID-19, we know that the numbers, we know the data we have about people are the right one. They are always underestimated because we don't know, in fact, how many people should have access, how many people are sick and should receive the support. But of course, these people will not show up. Not only they will not show up, but also they will not be in a situation to access, in fact, some of these services because these services are too expensive or too difficult for them to access.
Is there a possibility that there are millions of stateless people who have the virus that we are just not aware of?
I would be careful about the numbers. I'm not sure we can talk about millions of people who have the virus, but we should certainly talk about an important numbers of people that are, if you want, off our radar. And I think we start to understand that if we want to be serious about the public health and we want to make sure that COVID-19 is really managed as it is, we need to also focus on the most vulnerable people. That's very clear in our society, and we see that. And of course, among the most vulnerable, you have the migrants, and including the undocumented migrants, and they are part of our response. And that is the critical element. And I think state will learn soon. If you put part of the population a side of your, I would say, public health, assessment and then response. Especially when it comes to pandemia, your own population will be hit one day. So I think there is no questions. We need to integrate, and state need to integrate, in fact, the hundreds of thousands of and the millions of people that are migrant. Otherwise, we will not be able to solve the pandemic questions.
The efforts to help asylum seekers and refugees rely heavily on donations. These days, there's a huge need to increase donations, but the financial situation of the donors is worse than ever. How are you dealing with this gap?
You're right. There is a real risk over time that the funding going towards, in fact, helping refugee and helping migrants will dry. Or let's say, any funding which will not be somewhat tag COVID-19 or be perceived as in relationship with COVID-19 might dry, and I think might be reprioritized. So far, I feel this is not the case. We've been able to somewhat maintain program, maintain support to refugee around the world. But yes, the tendency is absolutely there, and I think I'm worried about this trend. I'm worried also because I think it's not just state again, but it's the ecosystem of also, as I mentioned, host community, but also NGOs. A lot of local NGOs plays a super important role, and they might be the first one hit by, in fact, the lack of funding when it comes to anything but COVID-19.
Let's focus on the challenges in this area for a moment. What are your main concerns in the West Bank and Gaza today and in the near future? How do you think the Israeli government has been handling the pandemic in these areas, and what should it do differently in the future?
I think we do have objectively two issues. One is you do have an objectively one part of the population, and I'm thinking about Gaza and specifically, which is in a situation of high risk on paper, and I think in reality also, which is, a high level of density, low level of health access, and being in fact contained in a very specific territory. So far as we know, COVID-19 is a problem, is an issue, but has maybe not hit as hard we were somewhat worried about. But I would be very, very careful about being able to look at the COVID-19 questions when it comes to a territory like Gaza. Super important. And it is a responsibility also of the Israeli authorities. They have a responsibility over this territory as well when it comes to international law. So I think they need to look into that very carefully. I think the other issue for me is the impact of COVID-19 over time. So it's not just the public health, but of course it's the social impact, it's the political impact, it's the economical impact. And we know that Israel and the region is directly affected also by that. And I think I really hope that we'll be in a situation where there will be a reflections about, how do we make sure that there is the employment, but also how do we make sure that we have the social fabric working. And here again, Israel has a responsibility towards its citizens, but also towards, in fact, Palestinian. So they will need to really sit down and find some solutions over time. And the solution can't just be a security solution.
The last subject I wanted to discuss is the complex relationship between climate change, migration, and COVID-19. Crossing international borders may sound like a faraway dream nowadays, but in the long run, borders will not stay closed forever. Even before the outbreak, experts estimated that by 2050, the number of climate change migrants would reach between 200 million and 1 billion. How do you think the pandemic might affect that? Will it increase these numbers or speed the process?
I think, first of all, I believe the experts are really right. I know it's always difficult to do expertise when it comes to numbers, but if you look at the numbers of people located, for example, in cities which will be below the surface of water of sea, if you see about what will happen to sea, I think, yes, we have to expect a lot of people moving, and which will create a lot of pressure within some of the state, but between states. Yes, I'm totally convinced that we will at least see 300, 400, 500 million people moving, without any doubt, over the next coming decade. I think what COVID-19 helped us to understand is we will see more of pandemia. So COVID-19 will, I hope, being treated and dealt with, but we will see more. I think it's rather clear. One thing we see with climate change right now is with the temperature going up, there starts to see clear evidence that there is also more, in fact, transmissions from of diseases from animals to human beings. That's all clear. We see that now. We know also the fact that we have so much change in terms of urbanization, that human beings have been closer to the animals are closer to the human beings. So I think these questions will be with us. So I think we will see more pandemia happening. And again, what my concern is that state sometimes will be willing to define more specifically who is us in my own community, who has the right to live in this territory, whereas I believe we will have to define a much more complex us, which is to allow that a much more fluid migration. There is no choices. We will have to have also common discussion. So my hope, what I really believe is we need to have global conversation, much more direct about the migration questions. We all, in most of society, needs migrants. At the same time, we need to define how many migrants, what does that mean? What are their rights? What is the social contract between people coming in my country? What do I want them to do or not? I think there are a number of super important questions that can't be let only managed through security or through humanitarian. This is a time where we need to be able to discuss, I would say, human flux, if you want, and what does that mean for our state, for our cities, and our social contract. And that needs to be discussed at all the level. I would say certainly at the local level, but also at the global level. That are really discussions. And you're right. What we've seen is, in fact, the climate change or the climate crisis is leading us to have more climate migrants. There is no questions. But at the same time, will also impact us when it comes to work, to our social fabric. So it is creating a vicious circle, which means we will have clearly more migrants. And then the pandemic help us to understand that we can't define and contain, that through a very specific angles. We need to have a much more broader view, and then being able to incentivize collaboration. That will be the only way to manage. Otherwise, we will again go into a much more tense period, and I think a period where we will see more conflict and more violence between communities and possibly between countries.
So you think that we might witness a problem of governments refusing to give refugee status as a result of climate change or public health concerns?
Yes, absolutely. It's already the case. I mean, you don't have to wait a crisis to see that happening. You have a lot of countries which have decided not at all to welcome any person, whatever the status. Refugee, migrants, forced migration, whatever. I don't want to have anybody on my territory. We've seen that, and the trend is rather heavy. So I think the key questions for me would be, what are the incentives? How do we accompany states to be able to somewhat deal with the migration questions and being able to welcome migrants? But again, I want to insist, this solidarity, if you want, needs to be organized, and we need to discuss about the social contract. Otherwise, a lot of states will continue to find only one response, which is close the border, contain, and hope that the migrants will go somewhere else.
Thank you so much, Mr. Daakour. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. All the best to you.